Officer Tom Wilson sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he watched the quiet streets of Pine Grove, an upscale Atlanta suburb. The morning sun cast long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns and million-dollar homes. He'd been working this beat for 15 years, and in his mind, he knew exactly who belonged here and who didn't. The road was quiet, too quiet for a Sunday morning. Usually, there'd be people heading to church or grabbing their morning coffee, but today felt different. Tom took a long sip from his lukewarm coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. His mind wandered to the morning briefing, where they'd discussed a series of break-ins in the neighboring districts. The captain had emphasized staying alert, and Tom prided himself on being the most vigilant officer in his precinct. That's when he spotted the silver Mercedes coming down Oak Lane. The car itself wasn't out of place in this neighborhood, but something about the driver caught his eye. Through the tinted windows, he could make out a young black woman behind the wheel. She was wearing what looked like an expensive suit, but Tom's prejudices immediately kicked in. In his mind, she didn't fit the profile of the usual residents. He watched as the Mercedes approached the stop sign at the corner of Oak and Maple. Tom leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. Even though the car came to a complete stop, he'd already made up his mind. 15 years of unchecked biases and a system that rarely questioned his decisions had reinforced his worst instincts. Flipping on his patrol lights, Tom pulled out behind the Mercedes. The driver signaled immediately and pulled over in a smooth, practiced motion, the kind that suggested she was familiar with proper procedure. As he approached the vehicle, he noticed something else. The driver was visibly pregnant. Through the window, he could see her reaching for what he assumed would be her license and registration, but his hand instinctively moved to rest on his weapon anyway. The interior of the car was immaculate, with a leather briefcase on the passenger seat and what looked like legal documents spread across the back seat. A small federal court parking pass hung from the rearview mirror, but Tom chose to ignore these details that didn't fit his preconceptions. As he got closer, he could see the driver's face clearly in her side mirror. She appeared calm and professional, adjusting her posture to accommodate her pregnant belly as she waited for him to approach. On her back seat, he noticed a black judge's robe neatly hung up, but his mind was already made up about how this interaction would go. The morning sun continued to rise, casting a golden glow across the neighborhood. Several residents had started to emerge from their homes, some pausing their morning routines to watch the scene unfold. A few pulled out their phones, sensing that something wasn't quite right about the situation. Tom straightened his badge and adjusted his body camera, which he'd conveniently forgotten to turn on. He'd done this dance hundreds of times before, but something about this stop would prove to be different from all the others. As he approached the driver's window, he had no idea that his next actions would not only change his life, but would spark a conversation that would ripple through the entire police department and beyond. The cool morning air carried the faint scent of jasmine from the nearby gardens, creating an odd contrast to the tension that was about to unfold. Birds chirped peacefully in the background, unaware of the storm that was about to break the tranquility of this peaceful Sunday morning in Pine Grove. This would become more than just another traffic stop. This would be the moment that would force Officer Tom Wilson to confront 15 years of unchecked biases and a system that had allowed them to flourish. But for now, he was just a cop approaching a car. Unaware that his world was about to turn upside down, Tom reached the driver's window, his face already set in a stern expression. The window rolled down smoothly, releasing a gentle waft of new car smell mixed with light perfume. The driver looked up at him with clear, steady eyes, one hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. "License and registration," Tom demanded, not bothering with the usual courtesies. His voice carried that edge of authority he perfected over years of traffic stops. "Of course, officer," the driver replied calmly, her voice carrying the polished tone of someone used to professional settings. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Tom's jaw tightened at the question. "You rolled through that stop sign back there." It wasn't true, and somewhere in the back of his mind he knew it. But he'd gotten used to people not questioning his word. "Officer, I'm certain I came to a complete stop," she responded, her voice remaining level as she handed over her documents. "In fact, my dashcam recorded the entire thing." The mention of a dashcam made Tom's neck heat up. He glanced at the small camera mounted on her windshield, its red light blinking steadily. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice rising slightly. "Officer, I'm 6 months pregnant," she explained, gesturing to her belly. "I've provided my documentation. Is there a specific reason you need me to exit the vehicle?" More neighbors had gathered on their front lawns now. The morning joggers had stopped their routines, and phones were definitely recording. Tom could feel the eyes on him, but something in him refused to back down. "I won't ask again," he said, his hand moving to rest on his belt. "Exit the vehicle now." The driver took a deep breath, her calm exterior showing the first cracks of concern. "Officer, I'm an attorney and I know my rights. I've complied with all your requests. I'm going to call my lawyer now." As she reached for her phone, Tom's training gave way to his worst instincts. He yanked open her car door, causing her to flinch back in surprise. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "You're being uncooperative." The driver's voice trembled slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I'm pregnant, officer. Please don't touch me. Everything is being recorded, and I have done nothing wrong." A woman in the crowd called out, "She's pregnant. Leave her alone." Others joined in, their voices mixing with the sound of more car doors opening as curious neighbors emerged from their homes. Tom's radio crackled with a voice from dispatch asking if he needed backup. The situation was spiraling, but his pride wouldn't let him step back. He reached for her arm, his grip firm. "You're resisting arrest," he announced, loud enough for his body camera to pick up if it had been on. The driver winced but didn't pull away. "I am not resisting. I am sitting in my car, complying with your requests and expressing concern for my unborn child. My name is—" "Out of the car now," Tom interrupted, not wanting to hear her name or explanation. More phones appeared in the crowd. Someone was live streaming. The morning sun now felt too bright, too exposing. Sweat began to bead on Tom's forehead as he realized he'd crossed a line he couldn't easily step back from. The driver pressed a button on her phone. "Siri called Dad," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the tense morning air. "And send him my location." Something about the confidence in her voice should have warned Tom. Something about the way she remained composed, even as he was losing control of the situation, should have made him pause. But 15 years of unchecked power had taught him the wrong lessons, and he was about to learn just how wrong those lessons had been. The crowd grew larger, their murmurs turning to outright protests. The morning birds had stopped singing, as if they too were watching the scene unfold. In the distance, another police siren wailed, heading their way. Tom's moment of truth was approaching, but he had no idea just how much this traffic stop was about to change everything. The backup sirens grew louder as Tom maintained his grip on the driver's arm. She remained seated, one hand still protecting her belly, her phone now recording everything. The morning had turned into something he hadn't planned, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. "Last warning," Tom growled, trying to mask his growing uncertainty with authority. "Either you step out on your own, or I'll help you out." The driver looked him straight in the eye. "Officer, I want to be very clear. I'm a federal prosecutor, I'm 6 months pregnant, and you're hurting my arm. There are at least 20 people recording this right now. Please think carefully about your next action." A police cruiser pulled up behind Tom's car, lights flashing. Officer Chen, a rookie Tom had trained himself, stepped out and assessed the scene. The look of confusion on the young officer's face made Tom's stomach tighten. "Everything okay here?" Chen called out, walking toward them cautiously. He could read the tension in the air, see the growing crowd with their phones raised. "This woman is resisting arrest," Tom announced, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I am not resisting anything," the driver stated clearly, her voice carrying to the crowd. "I'm sitting in my car after a routine traffic stop, being manhandled by an officer who hasn't given me any legitimate reason for his actions. I've provided my license and registration, I've stated that I'm pregnant, and I'm waiting for my father to arrive." Ken's eyes darted between Tom and the driver, then to the growing crowd. Someone in the back shouted she didn't do anything wrong. Another voice added, "We all saw her stop at the sign." The driver's phone buzzed. She glanced at it briefly, then looked back at Tom with an expression that made him feel uneasy. My father will be here in 3 minutes. Officer, I'm going to say this one more time. Please remove your hand from my arm. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now. The morning sun beat down on the scene as more police cruisers arrived. Tom could hear radio chatter as dispatch tried to figure out what was happening in their usually quiet neighborhood. Tom, Chen said quietly, moving closer. Maybe we should. Before he could finish, a black SUV with government plates screeched to a halt nearby. The back door opened, and a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out. Even from a distance, Tom could see the federal judge's pin on his lapel. The crowd parted as the man walked forward, his face a mask of controlled anger. "Remove your hand from my daughter immediately," he commanded in a voice that carried the weight of decades on the bench. Tom's fingers loosened their grip before his brain could tell them not to. The driver rubbed her arm gently, still maintaining her composure. "Dad," she said calmly, "this officer pulled me over, claiming I ran a stop sign. My dashcam shows that's not true. When I mentioned the dashcam, he ordered me out of the car. When I mentioned my pregnancy and asked to call my lawyer, he grabbed me." The judge's eyes never left Tom's face. "Officer, I'm sure you're aware that everything you've done in the last 10 minutes has been recorded by multiple sources. I'm also sure you know who I am, or you're about to find out. But right now, I want you to think very carefully about what happens next." Tom felt the strength leave his legs. In all his years on the force, he'd never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The weight of his badge, usually a source of power, now felt like it was dragging him down. The morning breeze carried the murmurs of the crowd, the click of cameras, the rustle of trees that had seen too many similar scenes. But this time would be different. This time, there would be no report to file away, no story to sweep under the rug. This time, Officer Tom Wilson would have to face the consequences of 15 years of unchecked power. Another police car pulled up, this one unmarked. The captain stepped out, his face grim. Tom knew, in that moment, that his world was about to change forever. The quiet Sunday morning had turned into the day of reckoning he never saw coming. The captain's footsteps seemed to echo across the suddenly quiet street as he approached. The crowd parted for him just as they had for the judge, their phones still recording every moment. Tom's collar felt too tight, his uniform too heavy under the morning sun. "Your Honor," the captain said, nodding respectfully to the judge. "I came as soon as I heard." His eyes moved from the judge to his daughter, noting her pregnant condition, then finally landed on Tom with a mix of disappointment and barely contained anger. The driver's father stepped forward, his voice low but clear. "Captain, I want this officer's badge and gun. Right now. We'll discuss the rest at the precinct." Tom opened his mouth to protest, but the captain cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Officer Wilson, surrender your weapon and badge to Officer Chen. Then you'll ride with me back to the station." The crowd watched in tense silence as Tom slowly unclipped his badge. His hands shook slightly as he removed his gun belt. The weight of 15 years of service lifted from his shoulders, leaving him feeling strangely empty. "Dad," the driver called softly, still sitting in her car. "My arm." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the red marks where Tom's grip had been. Someone in the crowd gasped. Several phones zoomed in to capture the image. The judge's face darkened. He turned to the captain. "This isn't just about a bad traffic stop anymore. This is about abuse of power, racial profiling, and assaulting a pregnant federal prosecutor. The Oversight Committee will be very interested in reviewing Officer Wilson's complete record." The mention of the Oversight Committee made Tom's stomach drop. The judge wasn't just any father protecting his daughter, he was the chairman of the Police Oversight Committee, the very body that could tear apart Tom's entire career. Officer Chen stepped forward, accepting Tom's badge and gun with a look that mixed pity with disgust. The young officer had once looked up to Tom as a mentor. Now he couldn't even meet his eyes. The crowd had grown larger, with neighbors calling others to come watch. Some had started live streaming the event, sharing it across social media. Tom could already imagine the headlines. "Racist cop assaults pregnant federal prosecutor." "Your daughter should get checked out at the hospital," the captain suggested to the judge. "We'll need medical documentation of any injuries." He turned to the gathering crowd. Anyone who recorded this incident, please stay to give your contact information to Officer Chen. Your videos will be important evidence. The driver's father helped her out of the car, supporting her carefully. As she stood, her pregnancy became even more obvious, making Tom's actions look even worse. She walked steadily to her father's SUV, her head held high, every inch the federal prosecutor she'd said she was. "I want every complaint ever filed against this officer on my desk by tomorrow morning," the judge ordered the captain. "Every traffic stop, every interaction, every write-up. If there's a pattern here, we're going to find it." Tom felt the world spinning around him. In just 30 minutes, he'd gone from respected senior officer to suspended and under investigation. All those times he'd gotten away with similar stops, all those complaints that had been buried or dismissed, they were all coming back now. The captain gripped Tom's arm firmly. "Let's go," he said quietly. "You've got a lot of explaining to do." As they walked to the captain's car, Tom could hear people in the crowd talking. Some were sharing their own stories of encounters with him. Others were calling their friends about what they'd just witnessed. The truth was spreading, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The quiet Sunday morning had turned into a watershed moment for the entire police department. Tom's actions wouldn't just cost him his job. They would spark a review of the whole system that had allowed him to abuse his power for so long. The captain's car door closed behind him with a final sounding thud. Through the window, Tom watched the judge consoling his daughter, the crowd still recording everything, and Officer Chen gathering witness statements. His comfortable world of unchecked authority had just crumbled, and his day of reckoning was only beginning. The police station buzzed with unusual energy for a Sunday. Word had spread fast, and every officer on duty found a reason to walk past the captain's office, where Tom sat waiting. Through the glass walls, he could see his fellow officers avoiding eye contact. People he'd worked with for years now looked at him like a stranger. The internal affairs investigator, a sharp-eyed woman with graying hair, spread folders across the captain's desk. Each folder represented a complaint against Tom, more than he'd realized existed. Some dated back years, their pages yellow with age. "Interesting pattern here," she said, her voice professionally neutral. "Multiple complaints about unnecessary force during traffic stops, all filed by minorities, all dismissed due to lack of evidence or officer's word against civilians." She looked up at Tom. "But today was different, wasn't it? Today there were videos. Lots of them." The captain stood by the window, watching more police cars arrive. The judge's SUV pulled into the reserved parking spot, a spot Tom had never known existed before today. "The media's already picked up the story," he said, holding up his phone. "It's trending on social media. The dashcam footage just went viral." Tom sank deeper into his chair. He'd seen dozens of officers sit in this same spot over the years, facing questions about their conduct. He'd always thought he was different, better, smarter. The door opened and a young officer stepped in. "Sir, the hospital just sent over their report. The prosecutor has bruising on her arm. They're documenting everything, including stress monitoring for the baby." The captain rubbed his forehead. "Any other officers involved in past incidents with Officer Wilson should come forward now," he announced to the room beyond his office. "Full immunity if you speak up today. Tomorrow might be too late." Through the glass, Tom watched two younger officers exchange glances. They'd been on patrol with him before, seen things, stayed quiet. Now they walked purposefully toward the Internal Affairs office. The investigator picked up another file. "Here's an interesting one from 3 months ago. A black woman, 8 months pregnant, pulled over for suspicious behavior. No charge filed, but she filed a complaint about aggressive behavior." She fixed Tom with a steady gaze. "Sound familiar?" Tom's throat felt dry. That incident had been buried like all the others. But now, with today's events making headlines, every old case would be dug up, every complaint re-examined. The station's front desk called up. "The judge is here with his daughter." They're ready to make their formal statement. The captain straightened his uniform. "Internal Affairs will handle the initial interview. I want everything by the book. No shortcuts, no favors, no cover-ups. This department's reputation is on the line." As if on cue, phones throughout the station buzzed with a news alert. The story had made national headlines. The image of a pregnant federal prosecutor, daughter of a prominent judge, being manhandled by a police officer, it struck every nerve in the ongoing national conversation about police conduct. Through the office window, Tom could see the prosecutor and her father being escorted to the interview room. She walked tall despite everything, her hand resting protectively over her belly. Other officers rushed to open doors for them, offer water, show respect that came too late to fix what had happened. The investigator gathered her files. "Officer Wilson, this isn't just about today. This is about every person you've ever stopped without cause. Every time you let your badge become a weapon. Every colleague who saw and stayed silent." She stood up. The blue wall of silence just came crashing down. The captain's phone buzzed again. "The police union rep is here," he announced. "But I should warn you, Wilson, even they're distancing themselves from this one. The video evidence is too clear, the victim too prominent, the witness count too high." Tom watched as more internal affairs investigators arrived, carrying boxes for collecting evidence. This wasn't going to end with a suspension or a slap on the wrist. His actions had finally caught up with him, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Outside the captain's office, the station hummed with activity. Officers who had once turned a blind eye now rushed to protect themselves, to tell their stories, to be on the right side of the coming storm. The old system of silence and protection was crumbling, and Tom sat at the center of its collapse. The next morning, the police station's training room was packed. Every available officer sat waiting, their faces tense. The chief of police stood at the front, flanked by internal affairs investigators and department heads. On the screen behind them, images from Tom's body camera history played silently. "What happened yesterday wasn't just one incident," the chief began, his voice heavy. "It was the final straw in a pattern we all allowed to continue. Starting today, everything changes." In a small office down the hall, Tom sat with his union representative, watching his career unravel. More complaints had surfaced overnight. People who'd stayed quiet for years were finally speaking up, sharing their stories on social media, calling the station. "They're offering a deal," the union rep explained, sliding a document across the desk. "Full cooperation with the investigation, complete transparency about past incidents, and mandatory bias training. In return, they won't press criminal charges." Tom stared at the paper. His hands, which had once confidently gripped his badge, now trembled slightly. "And if I don't take the deal?" Then the judge's daughter proceeds with criminal charges. The dashcam footage, witness videos, and hospital report make it an easy case. Plus, every past complaint gets reopened. The rep leaned forward. "Take the deal, Tom. It's time to face the truth." In the training room, the chief continued his address. "We're implementing immediate changes. Every traffic stop will be reviewed. Body cameras will be checked daily. Any pattern of racial bias will result in immediate suspension." Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some had worked with Tom for years, seen his behavior, said nothing. Now they watched their own conduct come under scrutiny. The internal affairs investigator stepped forward, holding up a thick file. This morning, 3 more officers came forward about incidents they witnessed. 2 resigned rather than face investigation. This isn't about one bad apple anymore. This is about the whole system. Down in the lobby, reporters gathered as more people arrived to file complaints. The judge's daughter had given a powerful interview that morning, speaking calmly about her experience and calling for department-wide reform. Tom picked up the pen, his hand heavy. The deal paper waited before him, its terms clear and unforgiving. Complete honesty about every incident, every traffic stop, every time he'd let his prejudices guide his actions. "The bias training program starts next week," the union rep said quietly. 6 months of intensive training, counseling, and community service. It won't be easy, but it's better than the alternative. In the chief's office, the judge sat reviewing department policies. His daughter's case had opened a door that couldn't be closed. "We're not just looking for punishment," he explained to the chief. "We're looking for real change. The kind that prevents this from happening to anyone else." The morning sun climbed higher, shining through windows that seemed to hide fewer secrets now. Officers who passed Tom's union rep's office walked quickly, avoiding eye contact. The old days of quiet cover-ups and looking the other way were ending. Tom signed the paper. Each stroke of the pen felt like admitting to years of wrongs he justified to himself. The weight of his actions, finally acknowledged, pressed down on him. "What happens now?" he asked, voiced barely above a whisper. "Now you tell the truth," the rep replied. "All of it, every stop, every incident, every time you cross the line. Then you learn from it, really learn." Outside, the city buzzed with the story. Social media filled with similar accounts from other departments. What had started as one traffic stop was becoming a movement for change. The chief's voice carried down the hallway as he concluded his address. "Yesterday showed us what we've become. Today shows us what we need to be. This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about who we are as a department, as public servants, as human beings." Tom stood up, his decision made. He would talk. Tell everything. Face what he'd done. The comfortable world of unchecked power was over, replaced by something harder but more honest. The real work of change was just beginning. 3 months into his mandatory bias training, Tom sat in a community center, surrounded by faces he would have once viewed with suspicion. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as people shared their stories of encounters with law enforcement. Today, he wasn't wearing his uniform. He hadn't worn it since that Sunday morning that changed everything. "Would you like to share your perspective?" asked the Groot facilitator, a respected community leader who'd been running these sessions for years. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Tom. He cleared his throat, standing slowly. His hands were shaking slightly, just as they had been when he signed his statement admitting to years of biased policing. "My name is Tom," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'm here because I finally had to face who I'd become." The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. In the back, he noticed the judge's daughter sitting quietly, her pregnancy now showing even more. She'd been attending these sessions regularly, not to shame him, but to help ensure real change happened. "For 15 years, I told myself I was just doing my job," Tom continued. "Every unfair stop, every time I used too much force, every person I treated with suspicion because of their skin color, I had an excuse ready, but I was lying to myself." The facilitator nodded encouragingly. Around the room, people leaned forward listening. Some had shared their own stories of being profiled, stopped, harassed. Stories that could have been about Tom. "Last week, I finished reviewing all my past incidents with Internal Affairs," he said. "Over 300 traffic stops that had no real cause. Dozens of complaints buried by the system. When I saw it all laid out like that," he paused, swallowing hard, "I couldn't hide from it anymore." A young mother in the front row held her baby closer. "What made you different that day?" she asked quietly. "Why did it take stopping a judge's daughter to change things?" The question hung in the air, heavy with truth. Tom looked down at his hands, hands that had once gripped his badge like a shield against accountability. "It shouldn't have taken that," he admitted. "Every person I stopped unfairly deserved better. The system protected me until it couldn't anymore." The judge's daughter shifted in her seat, one hand resting on her belly. She'd become a symbol of change in the department, but she'd made it clear this wasn't just about her case. It was about every case, every stop, every person who'd faced similar treatment. "The hardest part," Tom continued, his voice stronger now, "is facing how many lives I affected. Every person I stopped unfairly went home with fear, anger, distrust. I helped create that fear, and now I have to help fix it." The facilitator stepped forward. "That's why these sessions matter. Real change happens when we see each other as people, not stereotypes." From his seat, Tom could see the street outside. A patrol car drove by slowly. Officer Chen was on duty. The young officer had been one of the first to speak up about changing the department's culture. Now he led training sessions for new recruits, teaching them to police differently. "Yesterday, I visited the academy," Tom shared. "Not as an instructor like before, but as an example. I told them my story, showed them how bias corrupts good policing. Some of them couldn't even look at me, but they listened." The room felt lighter somehow, as if truth-telling itself could lift the weight of years of wrongs. The judge's daughter smiled slightly, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement of change happening. "The department's different now," Tom concluded. "Body cameras stay on. Traffic stops get reviewed. Officers speak up when they see something wrong. It shouldn't have taken what happened that Sunday morning, but at least real change is happening." As the session ended, people lingered, sharing more stories, building bridges where walls had once stood. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, but something had shifted. In this room, at least, healing had begun. 6 months after that fateful Sunday morning, Tom stood before a packed community meeting at City Hall. The judge sat in the front row, his daughter beside him, now cradling her newborn baby. The room hummed with anticipation as Tom adjusted the microphone. "When I last wore my badge," he began, "I thought I knew what power meant. I was wrong. Real power isn't about forcing people to obey. It's about serving and protecting everyone equally." The police chief stood at the back of the room watching. The department had changed dramatically over the past months. New policies were in place, cameras always rolled, and officers were learning to police differently. Tom's case had sparked a transformation that spread beyond their city. "Today, I'm here to share what I've learned," Tom continued, "not just from the training programs, but from listening to the people I hurt, from facing my own biases, from understanding the damage I caused." Through the grand windows of City Hall, the afternoon sun cast a warm glow. News cameras rolled, capturing every word. This wasn't just another police reform meeting, it was proof that change was possible. "Last week, I finished my mandatory training," Tom said, his voice steady. "But I'm not done learning. I've accepted a new role with the department's community outreach program. Not as an officer, I won't wear a badge again. Instead, I'll work with new recruits, sharing my story as a warning and a lesson." In the audience, Officer Chen nodded approvingly. He'd become a leader in the department's reform efforts, teaching officers how to build trust instead of fear. The changes weren't always easy, but they were necessary. "The judge's daughter gave birth last month," Tom continued, glancing at the tiny bundle in her arms. "When I think about the world that baby will grow up in, I want it to be better than the one I helped create. That starts with honesty about what went wrong." The room was silent now, everyone leaning in to listen. Even the baby seemed to sense the importance of the moment, staying peacefully quiet in its mother's arms. "We've made changes in the department," Tom explained. "Every traffic stop is reviewed. Officers get real training about bias. But the biggest change had to happen in here." He tapped his chest. "In our hearts. In how we see each other." The judge's daughter stood carefully, holding her baby. "6 months ago," she said clearly, "I was afraid for my life and my child's life during a routine traffic stop. Today, I'm part of the committee overseeing police reform. That's what real change looks like." Tom nodded gratefully. "The prosecutor I treated so badly that day became one of my teachers. She showed me what real strength looks like. Not the fake power of a badge, but the real power of working for change." The police chief stepped forward. "Thanks to the changes we've made, complaints are down 60%. Officer retention is up. Community trust is growing. We're becoming the department we should have been all along." As the meeting continued, people shared their own stories of recent interactions with police, stories of respect, proper procedure, and growing trust. The old culture of fear and bias was slowly being replaced by something better. "I can't undo what I did," Tom concluded, "but I can help make sure it doesn't happen again. That's my new job. That's my promise to this community." The judge rose to speak next, his presence commanding respect. But before he could begin, his grandchild made a soft sound. The room chuckled, tension breaking. Even the most formal moments could be touched by new life, new beginnings. In that room, surrounded by the community he'd once policed so wrongly, Tom felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Not for himself, but for the future. For a world where his story would be a lesson in what not to do and how to make it right. 1 year had passed since that life-changing Sunday morning. The community center buzzed with activity as people gathered for a special ceremony. Banners announcing 1 year of change hung from the walls, and the room was packed with faces both familiar and new. The judge's daughter stood at the podium, her baby now a curious 1-year-old sitting contentedly in her father's arms. Behind her, a screen displayed statistics about the police department's transformation over the past year. "When I was pulled over that day," she began, "I never imagined it would lead to this. Today, we're not just celebrating changes in one police department. We're celebrating a movement that's spread across the country." Tom sat in the middle of the crowd, no longer separated from the community he'd once policed. He watched as Officer Chen, now promoted to sergeant, helped set up a display showing the department's new training programs. In the past year, the speaker continued, our department has become a model for others. 0 incidents of racial profiling. Every traffic stop recorded and reviewed. Weekly community meetings. But numbers don't tell the whole story. She gestured to a wall covered with photographs, training sessions, community meetings, officers and citizens working together. In one corner, a TV showed news clips about how their small department had sparked nationwide changes in police training. The real story, she said, is about people changing. Officers learning to serve differently. Communities learning to trust again. And yes, even former officers learning to make amends. Tom stood up as she called him forward. Walking to the podium felt like crossing a bridge between his old life and his new purpose. His hands no longer shook when he spoke in public. A year ago, I was the problem, he said simply. Today, I'm part of the solution. I travel to police academies across the country, sharing my story. Not as a badge number or a cautionary tale, but as someone who learned the hardest lesson about power and prejudice. The baby made a happy sound, drawing smiles from the crowd. Life went on, bringing new beginnings even after the darkest moments. Our program has been adopted by 12 other departments, Tom continued. Every week, I meet officers who want to do better, be better. They learn from my mistakes so they don't repeat them. The police chief stepped forward next, holding up a thick binder. This is our new training manual, he announced. Written with input from the community, legal experts, and yes, even former officers who learned the hard way. It's being published next month for departments nationwide. Through the windows, the sun highlighted the community garden they'd planted together. Officers and residents working side by side. A simple symbol of growth and change. The judge's daughter took her baby back, holding her close. My daughter will grow up in a different world than the one I faced that morning, she said. She'll know officers as community partners, not threats. That's worth more than any statistics. Tom watched the mother and child, remembering how close he'd come to causing tragedy that day. But today wasn't about guilt, it was about transformation. Change isn't just about new rules or cameras, he concluded. It's about seeing each other as human beings. About understanding that true power comes from protecting and serving everyone equally. As the ceremony ended, people lingered, sharing stories and hopes for the future. Officer Chen showed kids the inside of his patrol car, explaining how the cameras worked, building trust through transparency. The judge approached Tom, his granddaughter reaching out with a tiny hand. You know, he said quietly, sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes. Tom nodded, watching the next generation of officers chatting with community members, learning the right way to serve and protect. His badge was gone, but his purpose remained, making sure his story helped create a better future for everyone. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, highlighting faces full of hope and determination. In this room, on this day, the divide between police and community had begun to heal, one relationship at a time.